Okay. So who was in Alan's most recent psychology course in autumn? I think Rupert. Were you there? Okay, but no one else? Okay, so this will be pretty fresh material, but I also will be rehearsing a few points that Alan was making, especially towards week 9 of the course. And I totally invite clarificatory questions, puzzlement, etc., whatever sort of interjections you have as I go along. Okay, so I'll be talking about the origin of voluntary animal motion, which you'd think the De Anima would have a lot to say, but many scholars to settle questions about what initiates voluntary animal motion surprisingly appeal to texts outside De Anima, things like De Sensu and De Motu Animalium. So I'll pretty much be following the trajectory of the secondary literature, which will lead me to predominantly be discussing De Motu Animalium, and I'll mostly be drawing on De Anima to give an account of the sense of alteration that gets used in De Motu Animalium, particularly trying to endorse or pretty much take the side of Bernier 2002's article on De Anima, Book 2, Chapter 5, and his account of extraordinary alteration that you'll find there. Okay, so to introduce the extremes of the secondary literature on psychophysicalism and the mind-body problem in Aristotle, Thomas Slakey and Wallace Matson, both from the 1960s, represent one extreme pole of how you account for the origins of animal motion by accounting for these origins in physical terms. And so Slakey writes in 1961, Aristotle tries to explain perception simply as an event in the sense organs, and as we'll see, perception is crucial for especially non-human animal motion, because whereas human beings sometimes can act voluntarily without drawing on the resources of perception, particularly when they're drawing on fantasia and noesis and other cognitive capacities, animals paradigmatically are acting according to their sense perception, especially those with the kind of least developed fantasia that we can imagine. So that's why perception is keying into these early quotes to explain one of the two extremes of these accounts of the origins of animal motion. So if perception plays a key role in the beginning of motion, Slakey thinks that can be explained physically. The other necessary component of motion, in addition to either aesthesis, fantasia, or something more cognitively rich like noesis or Rupert's facial expressions are amazing there. It doesn't seem like he likes that coffee. Or that tea. Okay. The additional component would be something like orexis. And orexis has a stronger connection to some kind of physical substructure. Accounts of anger in terms of boiling of the blood or something like that. So the harder case seems to be perception in terms of trying to give a completely physical account of the origins of animal motion. So Slakey says Aristotle tries to explain perception simply as an event in the sense organs, and we get a similar view from Matson that the mind-body identity was taken for granted in the Greco-Roman world. Indeed, throughout the whole classical corpus, there exists no denial of the view that sensing is a bodily process throughout. So that's one view, that sensation, perception is a bodily process. This shares features of the Nussbaum, Putnam, Surabji view, though Nussbaum, Putnam, and Surabji include something non-reducibly physical, that is something functionally psychic. Nonetheless, they think there's an ineliminable component to sensation, which is physical. So every mental act has a physiological component to it. There's an underlying physiological process for desire and perception, which would be the two necessary components if you look at Roman numeral 2 for getting voluntary animal motion off the ground. On the other hand, you have someone like Friedrich Salmson and then Bernier, who I'll bring in, who argue that there's no necessary underlying physiological process for sensation or perception. And Solomson writes in 1961, "It is doubtful whether the movement or the actualization occurring in the eye sees or the ear hears has any physical or physiological aspect." So you have Slakey and Mattson on the one view saying these simply are identified as physical events in the sense organs, whereas Solomson, on the other hand, says, in fact, you don't need any physical or physiological aspect for perception or sensation. I'm posing this in terms of physicalism, but if you think about what the word physical in English traces back to, it seems to trace back to phusis, and phusis, of course, is nature. What is the nature of a creature for Aristotle? It's its soul, and that'll be very important for the argument I'm making later. And so the terminology in English to pose this question between whether sensation or perception as an origin of voluntary animal motion is physical or not can be kind of misleading if you're trying to cash it out in terms of the Greek lexicon, because physical would mean phusis, which isn't a contrasting term with what is psychological. If you're looking for the phusis of a creature, you look to its soul, its psyche. And so there really is no contrast in the Greek lexical terms between physical and non-physical. Perhaps you could bring an ule or something like that, but that's not really how the secondary literature uses that vocabulary. So I just wanted to note that difficulty. Okay, so I've mentioned why accounts of perception being physical would be important for these accounts of animal motion. If you go to chapter 6 of De Motu Animalium, I'll be focusing on chapter 7 in my talk, but in chapter 6 you seem to get these necessary conditions, these enabling conditions for what voluntary motion would take. I'll quote, this is from the Prima Facie Symposium Aristotelicum translation, but it's also quoted in Prima Facie's introduction, so I'm attributing the translation to him. "For all animals, both cause movement and are moved for the sake of some end, so that this is the limit of every one of their motions," the end. "But we see that the things which move animals are discursive thoughts," so we have thought, something cognitive on the one hand, and appearance, these are kind of bound up cognitively, and decision, prohyresis, and wish, and appetite. So prohyresis, boulesis, and epithumia will be under the kind of broad category of desires, desiderative, orexis type things. And dianoia and fantasia will be these more cognitive ones. And you'll need one of each to get animal motion off the ground. So all these can be reduced to thought and desire. For both appearance and sense perception hold the same place as thought. And so there's aesthesis at the most basic level, playing this kind of functional role of noesis at its most refined for human beings, whereas wish, boulesis, thumos, epithumia are all desires or rexis. So you need a pair of some kind of cognitive grasp of an object and desire for animal motion to be possible. And so GD is me. I'm kind of explaining the view in De Anima, and I think it's broadly compatible with De Motu Animalium. I think it's broadly compatible with De Anima, but if anybody has thoughts about discontinuities between this account of the origin of motion in De Motu Animalium and what we get in De Anima, that would be super interesting if anybody wanted to weigh in on that. So cashing out this quote in my own terms, the components of voluntary animal motion have a desiderative component and a cognitive component. There is the cognitive apprehension of an object via aesthesis, fantasia, or noesis, and desire. If either is lacking, there is no motion, and you can explain this through an example of a doctor, and especially these two-way rational capacities. If a doctor has a desire to heal, she can't act until there's some patient. So that is, there's aesthesis, fantasia, or noesis of a patient to move the doctor towards the desire. Raw desire isn't enough. Similarly, if a doctor perceives that there's a patient needing of treatment, but they have no desire to treat that patient, you also won't get voluntary motion off the ground. So you need both together. And once the doctor cognitively grabs the patient, then she can act straight away. That's kind of the view of agency and patiency that we get in De Anima. All right. So I'll be focusing on the perceptive cognitive part of these two enabling conditions, because as I mentioned, orexis seems to have a more it's easier to explain orexis in terms of physiological processes, in terms of blood boiling and that sort of thing. It seems like it's a harder case to explain how perception requires some kind of physiological subprocess, though that's been argued, as I mentioned, from Slakey and Mattson, and I'll be picking up especially on the Putnam Nussbaum functionalist account of perception, which tries to argue that there is a necessary physiological process underlying every kind of sensation, and then really they use that to argue without much textual support that for this reason, if aesthesis has this necessary physical underlying process, then everything that plays that functional role, and so also fantasia and even noesis should have some kind of physical process that underlies it. But that's a even harder case to make, especially in De Anima 3. There's all this stuff that gives pretty decisive evidence that thinking doesn't have an physical organ associated with it. But nonetheless, Nussbaum and Putnam think if they can show at least aesthesis necessarily has this physical process underlying it, then they show, at least for maybe animals without noesis, or perhaps for humans with noesis, all the necessary components of initiating voluntary animal motion will have some kind of physical process underlying them. So in their article, Changing Aristotle's Mind, Putnam and Nussbaum go to chapter 7 of De Motu Animalium as their decisive evidence for the underlying physical process for perception. And so I've included Prima Facies' translation of this passage and Nussbaum's translation of this passage. I'm going to problematize Nussbaum and Putnam's interpretation of the passage, and then my original contribution will be suggesting how Berniet or any theorist like Salmson who wants to give a non-physical account of perception would be able to read this puppet passage from De Motu Animalium, chapter 7. So because it's pretty important, I'll read it out, though there are some significant differences in the translation and the textual critical decisions that Nussbaum and Prima Facie in the Symposium Aristotelicum make. This was Nussbaum's famous dissertation on De Motu Animalium, and I've included the critical apparati at the bottom of these pages. So I would welcome anyone's thoughts about the textual criticism about the two passages, problems with the translation, alternative readings, etc. All that kind of philological commentary would be super welcome. So I'll read through this puppet passage. First, I think I'll actually read out Nussbaum's because it came earlier in time. So this is from the late 70s, early 80s. So this then is the way that animals are impelled to move and act. And again, that's the subject of my talk, the origins of voluntary animal motion. What impels them? What's the starting point of it? The proximate reason for movement is desire, and this comes to be either through sense perception or through fantasia or thought. So again, we have these two broad functional roles that are getting motion off the ground. Desire on the one hand, and then either aesthesis, fantasia, or noesis on the other hand. With creatures that desire to act, it is sometimes from appetite or spiritedness, and sometimes from desire or wish that they make or act. The movement of animals is like that of automatic puppets, which are set moving when a small motion occurs. The cables are released from the pegs, and the cables are released and the pegs strike against one another. And Prima Facie is going to claim that this Greek about how the pegs strike against one another is grammatically impossible. I haven't included that material, but it's in the introduction to the Symposium Aristotelicum. And like that of the little cart, for the child riding in it pushes it straight forward, and yet it moves in a circle because it has wheels of unequal size. For the smaller acts like a center, as happens in the case of cylinders, for they have functioning parts that are of the same kind, the sinews and bones. The latter are like the pegs and the iron in our example, the sinews like the cables. When these are released and slackened, the creature moves. Now, in the puppets and carts, no alteration takes place, since if the inner wheels were to become smaller and again larger, the movement would still be circular. But in the animal, so here we're getting a contrast where in this motion of automata, we don't see any alteration of the parts. In the animal, we do. But in the animal, the same part has the capacity to become both larger and smaller and to change its shape as the parts expand because of heat and contract again because of cold and alter. Alteration is caused by fantasiae and sense perception and ideas. For sense perceptions are at once a kind of alteration, and this will be crucial for my ultimate point, the kind of alteration that is being signaled here by, I think it's tines usii. It's an aliosis tines usii. For sense perceptions are at once a kind of alteration, and fantasia and thinking have the power of the actual things. For it turns out that the form conceived of the warm or cold or pleasant or fearful is like the actual thing itself. That is why we shudder and are frightened just thinking of something. All these are affections and alterations. And if you go to part 4 of my talk, I've quoted from this paper, Changing Aristotle's Mind, with the upshot that Nussbaum and Putnam draw from the passage. Crucially, if you look at the very last sentence of the quotation, we conclude that the De Motu provides very powerful evidence that Aristotle conceives of both perceiving and desiring as thoroughly in matter. Their activity is accompanied of necessity by a transition in matter. So there we see they've moved again away from this physical locution in matter, which more straightforwardly tracks onto the Greek. But it's really not clear that there are 4 decisive pieces of evidence that I've indented justify this conclusion. I don't think I have much more detail I want to go into. Just to say that perhaps I think almost everything that Nussbaum and Putnam claim from parts 1 to 4 is entirely compatible with the alternative non-physical view I want to be sketching. And so if you read through their takeaways carefully, I think the non-physicalist account of perception can really accept all these things because mostly they have to do with the effects of perception rather than perception itself. So I'll say that so far. Okay. So now my kind of interpretive perspective on this chapter 7 passage is that Aristotle is trying to contrast automatic artificial motion with human motion to bring out some crucial differences. And what the crucial difference is will highlight what is unique about what it takes to initiate human motion versus artificial motion. And this will help decisively solve this debate between the physicalist and anti-physicalist interpretations of sensation, which is so important since sensation is one of these 2 enabling conditions of voluntary animal motion. So with that perspective in mind, I might just read through this Prima Facie interpretation. So rather than a single puppet, as Nussbaum, or the movement of animals is like that of automatic puppets, but it seems like when she's describing the cables released and the pegs striking one another, she's describing a single puppet in the way that it would automatically act. There's been research by Pavel Gregoric, who I think even created a movie, I couldn't find it on YouTube, of an automatic theater. And so they are rendering automata in this different way. I'll read out the passage with this alternative interpretation, and then in part 5, I'll give all the justifications that Prima Facie provides for this alternative reading. Okay, so now, again, pay attention to the contrast between animal voluntary motion and artificial voluntary motion, and see what artificial voluntary motion has, especially in terms of its initiation, that animal voluntary motion doesn't. And I think that's what I'm using the passage for, to try to get purchase on this debate between Bernian and Solmsen, these anti-physicalists and the physicalists on the other hand. Okay, so now I'll read out that passage one more time. In this way, then, animals have impulses to move and act, with desire being the last cause of their movement, and coming about either through perception or through appearance and thought. Of animals who desire to act, some produce or act because of spirit or appetite, others because of choice or wish. But again, I want to group these all under the kind of banner of desire or eresis. So now, rather than puppets, we're getting the view that automata refers to automatic theaters. Just as the automatic theaters are set in motion when only a small movement has happened, when the cables are released and the figure driver himself tries to move in a straight line again and again, but which is moved in a circle because it has unequal wheels, for the smaller one comes to function as a center point, just as the case in cylinders, so too are animals moved. So just as automatic theaters are set in motion, again, this initiation, only through a small movement, so too animals are moved. So mostly what we're getting with this analogy or parallel is the fact that motion in an animal is initiated through very small alterations in terms of heating and cooling, and those have cascading effects that create a chain of heatings and coolings that go from the heart all the way out to the outer limbs and muscles. And so just as some small movement initiates this automatic theater, leading to all these further motions, where a small push can get a vehicle with smaller wheel to start moving in a circle, so too does only some small initiation lead to these full voluntary animal motions. Okay, so I'm at line 701b7 and continuing. For they have organs of that sort, with the nature of sinews and the nature of bones, the ones like wood and iron in the former case, and the other sinews like the cables. They are moved when these things are untied and unfastened. Well, within the automatic theaters and wagons, there is no alteration taking place, since if inside the wheels were to become smaller and then greater, then the same thing would still be moved in a circle. But in an animal, the same thing can become smaller and bigger and change forms when the parts grow and contract, and through heat and pneuma and cold, i.e. by alteration. These alterations are caused by appearances and perceptions and thoughts, for perceptions immediately have their being as alterations of a certain type, but appearance and thoughts have the power of their objects. For somehow or other, the form of something hot or cold or sweet or frightening, when held in thought, just then is in its being like the things themselves, which is why merely thinking about them makes us shudder and get scared. All these are affections and alterations. So again, the notion of the alteration of a certain type is what I'll be concluding my presentation with. Okay, so now I thought I would just bring in Prima Facie's reasoning for shifting from a single puppet to an automatic theater, because ultimately I think that's the difference between Nussbaum's account, in which the initiated motion is just a push of a single puppet. It seems like this thing closer to an efficient cause, whereas the organization of the theater and the interrelation of all the different parts for a certain purpose, I'll try to liken to animal nature or something like that, so such that there's a special kind of alteration, which is the activation of this nature, which is not a physical efficient cause, but rather this extraordinary alteration which doesn't need any kind of underlying physical process. Okay, so if people are interested, I'd read through Prima Faci's reasoning on this puppet stuff because it's relevant to me, and I'm very interested in any comments people have to say about it, about this decision between the single puppet versus the stage in De Motu Animalium, Chapter 7. Okay, so this is from the introduction to the Symposium Aristotelicum by Prima Facie. Any attempt to make further progress must be based on the only extant ancient Greek monograph on automata, the Automatopoetica by Hero of Alexandria, who probably wrote in the second half of the 1st century AD. His automata are automatic puppet shows, so an entire show, an automaton theater, hence our rendering automatic theater, of which there are two kinds, one mobile and one stationary. Hero describes the technology of the automata hupagonta as still immature and less reliable than the automata stata. For his treatment of the latter, by contrast, he can almost entirely rely on the automata poetica of Philo of Byzantium. For historical reasons, then, it seems likely that the automata Aristotle is referring to in our passage, as well as elsewhere, are more or less closely related to Philo's early Hellenistic automata stata. These are these stationary puppet theaters, rather than a single puppet. In a description of an automaton, however, we must distinguish two possible subjects. First, the inner mechanics, and second, what the spectators can see on stage. Accordingly, the first step is in amending our lacunos passage is to grasp which of those two subjects is at stake here, or more technically speaking, to find out whether the phrase kruonton pros alelas refers to an intermediate stage of the transmission of power, or rather its visible endpoint. Our evidence comprises Hero's description of transmission of power in Philo's Hellenistic automaton staton and his description of what can be seen on the stage of his automaton. As to Hero's description of the visible effects, the first scene of Philo's automatostaton will suffice for our purposes. As soon as the automaton has been set moving and the stage has been opened, painted figures become visible, which are equipped with one movable arm and which represent the Greeks before Troy at the end of the war. They are repairing their ships in order to lower them into the water again. They are sawing, hewing with axes. Hero's description of the transmission of power within the automaton has been conveniently summarized by A.G. Gerhard Drachmann in the following terms. The moving force is a heavy weight fitting into a container full of millet or mustard seeds. The seeds run out through a narrow hole. The weight comes down at a determined rate, and it turns an axle from which it is suspended by a cord. All the movements are taken from this axle by means of strings. If a thing has to happen only once, as a back cloth being dropped, it may be worked by a separate weight which is released by pulling out a pin. A movement of the arm of a puppet, e.g. hammering, is produced by pins on a wheel acting on the short end of the lever. What's that?
Oh, how gratifying.
Nice. It seems fairly evident that within the transmission of power here described, there is no room for an intermediate stage at which two or more items strike two or more items against each other. Apart from the fact that this scenario would introduce a kind of complication which is quite alien to Philo's straightforward mechanics, it seems also difficult to imagine how the transmission of power could at all continue after A prime, etc. would have managed to strike B prime against one another. The description of what can be seen on stage, by contrast, is much more hospitable to such a constellation, since according to Hero, the movable arms of several painted figures could be shown to be sawing and hewing with axes. It might have been equally possible to represent couples of figures opposed to each other, either of which holds an instrument in its movable arm, and which strike these instruments against one another. Furthermore, in the Attic prose, kruein pros plus accusative typically refers to striking pieces of armor or weapons against one another, so we deem it highly probable that the figures of Aristotle's automatic theater are striking cutting weapons against one another with their movable arm. If this is correct, the missing syntactical object of the striking was a feminine noun designating a cutting weapon, whereas the missing syntactical subject of the striking is likely to be zoidia, the technical term for the painted or partly movable figures of an automaton staton. So we suggest the following exempli gratia reconstruction of our passage, which is based on the new manuscript variant, pros aleles, and which aims at restoring at least the structure of the phrase, even if we cannot, of course, be sure of the exact wording. And so that's what we get at the top of page 6. Just as the automatic theaters are set in motion only when a small movement has happened, when the cables are released and the figures immediately strike their sabers against one another. Okay, so again, Nussbaum and Putnam want to use this passage that we've been going through, either in terms of one puppet or this automatic theater, to justify their claim that perception is physical, because there's this description of this whole chain of physical processes which it initiates. But it really doesn't seem sufficient from all their evidence to show that that which initiates the chain of causes is on the same order or the same mode of being, namely some physical material object, as the chain of causes which it initiates. And so I'm going to give an alternative account via Berniet's notion of alteration, how this initiating perception could start these kind of puppets in motion in a way that doesn't require some kind of physical cause. So to turn to Berniet's account of alteration and the particular kind of alteration that perception is, he seems to claim that not all perceivings, aestheses, generate heatings and coolings. For instance, those that are not paired with desire do not generate voluntary animal motion. And so, first of all, Putnam and Nussbaum have a difficulty of explaining why certain perceptions, aestheses, generate this causal chain of efficient causes, as opposed to those perceptions which don't. Because it seems like if all perception were some kind of physical process, there wouldn't be a principal distinction between those perceptions that generate motion when there's a desire present versus those which don't seem to cause any physical changes when there's not a desire present. Berniet's alternative account of alteration, that is some kind of alteration of perception, which I've bolded in the English and the Greek, which comes at 701b17 and following. Berniet classifies as a third kind of alteration, that is a kind of alteration which is the actualization of the preservation of a hexis. And so, whereas the first kind of alteration, that is unqualified alteration or ordinary alteration, or the kind of alteration that Aristotle usually is talking about when he doesn't bring in some kind of qualifier like T-ness or something like that, are qualitative changes where there's a privation at the beginning of the change and a form is acquired to account for the qualitative change at the end of the change, or that some substance will begin containing the form of something and the change will be a change to the lack of that form. It'll be the deprivation of that form. So Berniet calls those ordinary alterations, which on the bottom of page 6 are classified as alt1. Ordinary alteration is the replacement of one quality by a contrary quality from the same range. And of course, these can occur in artificial substances, living substances, anything that is a subject of qualitative change. The other two kinds of alteration only can occur in things with a nature. I think living things with a nature. And so the second kind of alteration is called unordinary alteration, and that is the development of dispositions which perfect a thing's nature. So those things which don't have their own nature are not candidates for this kind of unordinary alteration, which is the change from not having a perfected disposition to developing in a way that acquires that perfected disposition. So you can imagine a young creature that doesn't have its eyes fully open yet or doesn't have its ears fully developed. The alteration from the lack of a fully developed sense capacity to the full attainment of a sense capacity would be this unordinary alteration, according to Berniet. And what separates that from these ordinary alterations is that it is a perfection of the thing's nature, whereas many of these other qualitative changes don't perfect the thing's nature. Then there's the even more special kind of alteration. Once a creature has gone through unordinary alterations such that it has perfected its dispositions and capacities, there's the final stage of actualizing those capacities. So you can imagine some kind of animal where the eyes aren't fully open yet. I think puppies don't have their eyes fully open, and the mama bitch has to lick the eyes open, if I'm not mistaken. And so that would be, as the dog's eyes are developing, that would be not an ordinary, but an unordinary alteration, because we're perfecting the disposition of the dog to see. And then at the final stage, the dog would open its eyes and actually see. And when it's actualizing its nature through using its dispositions, this counts as extraordinary alteration, according to Bernier. And this is when the disposition passes from inactivity to exercise. And Bernier has the view that this does not occur in time. These are simultaneous. So whereas ordinary alterations necessarily are diachronic, extraordinary alterations are always synchronic. They're instantaneous, something like that. I won't go into too much detail about this, but there are associated potentialities and associated actualities at the bottom of page 6, which correspond to these different alterations. And so if you return to the De Motu Animalium passage from chapter 7, we can see the qualification of the kind of alteration that sense perception is. So this is, again, 701b, 17 and following. Alioisen de I fantasiae kai I aesthesis kai I enoiai I mengar aesthesis euthus uparkosin alioisis tines uisai. Its being is some kind of alteration. Bernier wants to argue that because, on the grounds of De Anima 2.5, perception is part of the perfection of a creature with a nature, that actualizing that capacity, which is part of its nature, is a extraordinary kind of alteration. And these extraordinary alterations do not require any kind of physical substrate, particularly because they're instantaneous. Anything that's any instantaneous change can't be a physical change, as I understand it, according to Aristotle's physics. So therefore, on Bernier's disambiguation of kinds of alteration, we don't need to read the alteration that sense perception is initiating animal motion as something like an efficient cause that is the first push for a puppet or a theater, the way that Nussbaum and Putnam want to read the passage. Rather, it would be a actualization of the perfection of the creature. So here you have a disanalogy between artificial systems and living creatures. Artificial systems have some kind of form, some kind of taxis, and inner workings which are put into them by a craftsman or something like that. Living creatures have a nature that resides inside of them. And this nature provides its own kind of logos that guides human action or animal action the same way that the form of the sword that the sword maker has guides the action of the sword maker when he creates a sword. And so it is the rational principle that is organizing all the different motions, which is what the artificial, let me get the term from prima facie, the artificial automata stata, the automata upagonta, has as an artifact that living creatures have through their nature. And it's the actualization of that, which is the crucial comparison that Aristotle's making in the passage. So Bernietz never analyzes the De Motu Animalium passage. He only sticks to the De Anima and some other Aristotelian texts to develop this theory of alteration. So my original contribution is trying to see on a non-functionalist, non-psychophysicalist interpretation of De Motu Animalium, how we want to read that passage in chapter 7. And my proposal is thinking of what initiates motion in terms of sense perception as an actualization of nature, which is the kind of guiding, organizing principle of motion, the same way that the artificial puppet show has some kind of artificial organization, which, when initiated through some small motion, kind of operates on its own in an automatic way. So thank you, everybody. That's the project. Appreciate your attention. Yes?
Okay. So thanks for that. I guess one thing I'm wondering about is why do you think there's like a contrast between the the puppets, whatever they may be, whether they be like puppet theaters or individual puppets, and animals? It seems to me like Bernier kind of take on board this idea that like perception as it occurs in the passage is not understood to be a psychophysical process, but desire is. And then it seems like you could read the puppet passage in the more standard way. So I guess I'm thinking like maybe a couple things. One, it's noteworthy that he talks about desire as like the last cause of animal motion, and I guess I'm thinking like, what does it mean by the last cause? It means like the last psychological cause, right? There are other things that have to happen in the body to kind of like precipitate this sort of like walking around or whatever. Desire, he says, though, comes about through other like earlier psychological causes, which need not be understood as sort of having any kind of like physical base, or at least there's nothing in the passage that suggests they have physical base. So like thought, perception, whatever, depending on the kind of animal. And then, like, desire is linked to this small motion. What is a small motion? It's some kind of expansion or contraction. Okay, like expansion or contraction of what? Presumably of the heart, right? Like the heart has got a mind of heart.
The pneuma around the heart.
Right, the pneuma in the heart. And because the pneuma has, like, both heat and cold in it, it's capable of expanding and contracting both. But, like, the question is, okay, so suppose desire, which is, like, realized physically, like in the heart in this way, like produces this tiny expansion and contraction of pneuma. Like, why does that make my whole body move around and not just cause this like tiny change in the vicinity of my heart? And then it seems like what Bernier could say is like, oh, well, that's going to be a totally physical process.
Yes.
Nothing psychological.
Yes.
And that's what the puppets are about. That it's sort of like, in the same way as I move one tiny peg in the automatic puppet show, and it sort of has this chain reaction. Like, so too, this tiny contraction of my heart produces like this much more like large effects or something like that.
That's absolutely right. I guess I'm trying to find the grounds at which I'd find the conflict between the Nussbaum-Putnam reading, which bottoms out in the claim that Aristotle conceives of perceiving as thoroughly enmattered through this passage, because we're reading the passage, we want to read it in a kind of compatible way for both, but they have this difference of view about whether perception is enmattered or not. So I'm trying to find the point of conflict.
I think it's just like no evidence in the passage that Nussbaum is right.
Okay.
I think it's just there's just no, and actually there's evidence that she might be wrong. Hence, like why desire is described as kind of the last cause. Right, it's the link between the mind and the body is like this thing.
I just want to record that line every time somebody references Nussbaum.
Yeah, no, Nesbeth.
Well, no, I mean, like, I also think like the stuff he says here about how like thinking of a frightening thing makes you shudder and like that sort of thing. It does sort of make it seem like what he has in mind is really like the emotions. But like the emotions, like desire is one of the emotions. Is that right? And those are like kinds of pleasure and pain, and kinds of pleasure and pain like should be described in a psychophysical way, like as suggested by Danima 1:1, and you can sort of understand how those would like connect up directly with the kind of expansion and contraction. So like the sort of aliosis issue in Danima 2:5 in perception, like it just seems like that's not the kind of alteration he has in mind. The kind of alteration he has in mind is like heating and cooling, and that's like very much a sort of standard alteration. But that's not to do with perception. So yeah, I think you're right, but it seems to me like you could even sort of go harder against like the Nussbaum view.
Yeah, I guess the problem would be this line right before 18 that Imengar aesthesis euthus uparkosin aliosis tines usai. So you have aesthesis in this aliosis, and if we're saying that the aliosis is this more physical reading, it seems like that pushes us towards a physical reading of aesthesis. I guess that's the strongest response I could think of.
I guess I can see why, right? Like it seems as though the alterations that he's interested in are the sort of like growing and shrinking caused by heating and chilling. The cause of those alterations is aesthesis, which is itself an alteration. But the way that aesthesis causes those alterations need not be by sort of being partially like in matter itself. It could be that like I see something, it terrifies me. My fear is like psychophysically realized. My heart kind of like contracts because it chills or something like that. And right, so the causal mechanism could be a different one, and it could be the aliosis he's got in mind when he talks about alteration is a different kind of, or sorry, when he talks about perception. It's always about it in mind when he talks about alteration, I guess, is different from in aliosis he's got in mind when he talks about like the initiation of this sort of chain of events. I don't know.
That's really going to be my strategy, so I really appreciate you articulating all this for me.
Great.
Very helpful. I actually don't have a very developed view on Aristotle and the emotions. You know, Aristotle's more Plato's my dissertation guy, so Aristotle I'm a little less of an expert on. But Chris has taught classes on the emotions, and so this is something to look in further to see whether it's just kind of desiderative or whether there is a cognitive component to these emotions. Yeah.
You should look at Rhetoric 2.
Thank you.
Where he talks about they're very involved. So like, I mean, anger, for instance, is sort of like he talks about it as involving like a memory of like a past slight and an anticipation of like future vengeance. And the memory of the past slight produces a kind of pain, which then mixes with the pleasure that has to do with like the anticipation of the future vengeance. And all of this should be read in the context of like Danima 1:1, where he talks about the kind of like physical realization of this, like the boiling of the blood. And so it definitely seems like it's pretty involved. For the lower animals, you're not going to want to necessarily say that they have emotions of this degree of complexity because they don't necessarily have like fantasy eye of this degree of complexity. But nevertheless, like it does seem as though just sensation alone could produce. And the fact that he's got this kind of thing in his mind is suggested by the role that like fantasy plays in desire, right? Like when I desire something, I like entertain like a phantasm of that thing. And given the role that fantasy plays in the emotions, it's sort of reasonable to think like I'm sort of fantasizing about like going home and taking a shower or something like that produces a sort of anticipatory pleasure. And the same phantasma can then sort of like be the foundation of both like my desiderative states and also the sort of pleasure. And the pleasure is what produces the kind of like motion in the heart, which then makes my body like move about and go after the thing. And so like it seems as though all of that I think is like really it's compatible with what you're saying. Yeah.
I don't know if Roy or Jonathan remembers. Roy gave his very first work in progress. Landon, his very first work in progress retreat talk on the role that Fantasia plays initiating motion or something like that. So it's full circle back to that. Yeah, nice. Thank you for those suggestions and spelling out how my account the contours it'll probably take. Really, really helpful for the project. Thank you.
But yeah, I think you're right. This bound is wrong.
Yeah, I guess a lot of people agree with that, and so the original work I'm doing is trying to, I guess some of this Bernian stuff on the alterations is controversial, but at least showing how it might, how he can read the same passage that Nussbaum is using and relying on as one of her main pieces of evidence in this Changing Aristotle's Mind essay, and then show maybe that it's a plausible interpretation, or it helps get off the ground this distinction between kinds of alterations. And you really helped show how I might especially put perception or the cognitive component of the initiation of animal motion before desire, and the passage really helps spell that out. How we get the non-physical before the physical or something like that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I ask about the automated theatre?
Yes.
I know the reasoning seems very suspect from Vivasi's reasoning. So, 4 centuries later, someone, an engineer, someone who's, as it were, his role in either society is creating new things, is dealing with these automated theatres. Right? There are 2 sorts, one moves and one doesn't. We like the moving one, I take it for this one, because it's about motion, but we don't get the moving one because it's mature, so we need to have the static one. And we're going to rely on a text we don't even have, which is Philo. So I don't know why we accept this at all. I mean, there's references to puppets in Plato and Aristotle. They don't need to be puppet theatres. I was just trying to get, is there any further evidence that Vivasi marshals this thesis?
Yes, I believe it's the grammar of Cruonton, the pegs. So let me try to get that line number, especially in Nussbaum's Greek, because I think he might try to amend it. So it looks like that's at line 701b3-ish. Let me see. I've bolded it in the Prima Facie Greek text.
There's like a missing, Kuronton doesn't really have a subject.
Yeah, there it is.
Unless you take Strablon as the subject,
Yes.
which is kind of weird.
Yes. So there's that grammatical weirdness, which I think is pushing Prima Facie to try to make sense of this passage and supplement it. And that's part of the motivation to go to the historical record and all that kind of stuff about puppet shows and that sort of thing. So I think that grammatical difficulty of the Kronton Alela is his other kind of stated motivation. And there's additional research that's been done by Pavel Gregoric, and I'll have to go through that more carefully and see all his reasoning behind this puppet theater kind of thing, because that's been a big project for him, creating videos of it, and I think he has also an article about it in the Symposium Aristotelicum that I didn't dive into as deeply as Prima Facie's more summary account in the introduction.
I think he doesn't need automata to mean theatres here. So what he's saying is rather the image we're being given is the image of something like a theatrical show where puppets are jostling with each other. So presumably that didn't even be that involved.
I guess one thing, if it's just one puppet, or if it's just some kind of if it's a less articulated, manifold theater, you would need less of a principle of organization or something like that. Alan has drawn attention to this difference between Nussbaum's initial translation of the passage and then all this new work in the Symposium Aristotelicum. So he thinks it's really important, this change. And I think I'm kind of taking my cues from him that what's significant about the difference is the emphasis on some kind of organization that goes on between all these different parts in the puppet theater that wouldn't be necessary if it was just some kind of chain of pegs moving for a single puppet or something like that. And so if I want to create this strong analogy between the nature of an animal as accounting for the kind of alteration that perception is, the analogous case for the automata, I think, will be the taxis or something like that of the whatever they are, and I think you get a more complex organization in the theater. So that's, I think, what's pushing me towards the theater reading, to try to liken it to human nature and the way that animal motion is governed by some kind of organizing principle or something like that, which is akin to the form of the sword and the sword maker guiding the sword maker's actions. So half of this is exegesis from things Alan said in Fall, and half of it's kind of just my own original, trying to make it all work. Yeah.
So, I do want to just following up on this question.
Thank you.
Like,
Thank you, Robert, for that question.
Yeah, so like, I haven't looked up the Easy, so I don't know, but like, the fact that he's going to these later texts, like, is this because we don't have good, like, unambiguous usages of automata contemporaneous with Aristotle? Which I'm surprising.
In the politics, for instance, I know he talks about them in book 1 in terms of the slave thing. And I think we get automata for Daedalus creates automata.
Right.
So there are more classical instances of it.
And yeah, but I guess like, yeah, so and these are, I have to like, these are not in, like, are these ambiguous in the same way?
No, they seem to be more the moving puppet thing rather than a whole
yeah, that seems to be pretty
theater.
Strong reason to think that we shouldn't be looking at
Nice.
like first century texts too. I think I'm sympathetic to Rupert on this one.
Yeah.
And a lot seems to have changed in the Hellenistic period in terms of like.
Yeah, a few events happened in between.
Yes.
Well, I mean, like I guess especially in terms of like the development of puppets.
Yeah.
A lot of puppet ingenuity.
And a number of philosophical shifts.
Yeah.
This is all really helpful to get this skepticism about that, if especially if I'm relying it so heavily on my like new interpretation of the analogy.
I wonder how similar they are to like contemporary Sicilian shows.
Probably not very. They seem very primitive.
I think they also think it makes better philosophical sense of the text.
But it seems like they've been hitting swords together.
Hitting swords, yeah.
Maybe commonality.
Yeah, yeah.
Anyway, so this.
I think it makes
I do find, I do find really like the text is weird. The fact that you do have to fit something in, and Nussbaum fits in wood to one Zulu. So.
Because Alenas, that doesn't require the hypothesis of a puppet theatre.
No,
It just requires two puppets.
No, but hold on. So prosalelos requires a feminine. Yeah, there's the grammar, right? So like the Kuronton can't go with Streblon because that's feminine, and it needs some sort of object with prosalelos because that's feminine, unless they're striking the Strebli together, but that doesn't really make sense. So.
Alenas would have a reflexive sort of striking against one another.
But presumably the reflexive would be referring to the subject, right? Of the
Yeah.
Automaton. Yeah, well,
So
either
it's still the gender issue still there.
there's a gender issue. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I don't know. It does seem like you need some sort of bold emendation here. Which isn't to say, of course, that prima facie is correct. It's not clear that you couldn't amend it in a way that kept it to be, about an individual puppet, but it is weird.
So you first did manuscripts, but that's not in the critical.
I have the guide for all the abbreviations. If anybody wants me to pull that up or airdrop it for all the manuscripts.
Okay, so you've got Ruonton, Alala, Frodonto, Alalingo.
Right. Yeah. so Nussbaum is both adding Sulon and amending to Alula.
Sorry, I didn't have my phone on me. I just saw your text. Do you want to eat here, or did you take it to go? To go. You got it. Okay, we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, so I suppose, what does the prima facie reading have over the Nussbaum reading? Putting the philosophical considerations to one side, and because we don't need to accept the Nussbaum philosophical.
Yeah, good point. It looks like he's supplying less, so that might be preferable, all things considered.
Right, because I'm trying to remember what's actually what all the differences, but I think so the whole Veda tradition did not exist at the time that Nussbaum was.
Yeah, that sounds right. He mentions in the
Or it existed but was not known.
yeah. So this was
The Veda tradition is the pros. Now I think it's possible that it is just possible that Kumvesi, as I recall, might be slightly partial to the Veda reading because he discovered it.
I did not know that.
I remember so we went to Rhodes in this class on Demo too, and my recollection was that there were a number of places where it wasn't clear that it was actually better in him, but like he seemed to really be plugging for the Veda, partly this is psychological, but it seemed like he might be kind of.
It's hard now.
yeah. It's there at the bottom of page 5. So we suggest the following exempli gratia reconstruction of our passage, which is based on the new variants from these manuscripts.
But he doesn't print that in the text, right? It's just
It's down there in the apparatus criticus.
And he needs a Machaira. Just about. So he does have 2 missing.
Was it fantastic? It was like cool. I really laughed, but I was just really tired. So.
Could you spell that out for me a little bit? I'm sorry
So
for the rudimentary.
he thinks that what's being knocked together, as far as I can, just on the sentence, just the
Yep.
so it suggests, presumably are the swords, the Machaira.
Yep.
Feminine, plural, alela.
Okay.
I think that's also not there. So we still have a missing subject. Missing object. It's really,
Whenever they have the souvenir cut, they're like the biggest one.
yeah.
Yeah.
I don't get it. I really don't.
I've got all of the what you call it's there,
Do you remember this coming up during fall? These puppets?
I was mostly drunk, Jane.
Okay.
During the puppet one.
I'm pretty sure it covers it.
It was the only way we could handle our puppets.
And it was pretty dusty. But I remember thinking that this felt as well. I don't remember anything about that class.
All it takes is a drunken stupor.
But so how much does your reading depend on this?
So it would be to find textual basis for Berniet's distinction between these kinds of alterations, so that if I wanted to read in the 3 alterations from De Anima 2.5 into the De Motu Animalium passage and explain the tinus usia of aesthesis in terms of these qualifications, I imagined that if I'm looking for some equivalent, if I'm saying it's the nature of the creature which is serving this non-physical role of initiating and guiding motion, then that would be somehow the nature of the creature is equivalent to the taxis of the puppet show, all the kind of organization of all these different moving parts that he was describing. And so it's not just some kind of blind chain of efficient causation or something like that, but rather it's initiating the activization of some structured order or something like that. And for this example, I keep bringing in Alan's example of the analogy I'm trying to draw is that the organization and structure of the puppet show is equivalent to the nature of the creature, which is equivalent to the form of the sword in the sword maker. And all three of these things are kind of guiding the orderly I said cascade, unfurling, the orderly process of these motions or something like that.
Is it really like the sword and the sword maker? Because it sounds like, to the extent that nature is playing a role here, it's in a subpersonal way. That what he's explained is how the sort of personal aspect of animal psychology can be an efficient cause, and it's an efficient cause sort of by producing this shrinking or expansion in the heart, but then everything after that seems like it's subpersonal.
Yes.
And so how is that the form?
Because I think that the development of these things, so there's also this claim, I think it's from GC, that everything develops all at once or something like that. Everything grows in the same rate. It seems very implausible on its face. Let me see if I brought my notebook.
Yeah, right. I mean, right. So, in the GC, he wants to say, if I eat a banana, it's not like banana-shaped growth will
yes.
project.
Yes.
Me. Rather, just I grow in a kind of proportional
yes,
way.
that proportional way. So it's that proportionality that I'm really trying to highlight, and it's the form, the soul, which is the form and the nature of the creature, which is responsible for that proportionality. And so I'm thinking the form of the sword and the sword maker is responsible for the proportionality of the, product of the sword that gets created. And it's this proportionality of the controlling proportionality in the puppet show that the theater offers.
Is really what's at issue here? I mean, this isn't really about growth, right? There's a tiny bit of growth in the heart, but I'm just thinking it's going to be very small, right? My heart does not grow huge. It does not grow 3 sizes on any occasion, not even Christmas. And the stuff that happens, and it's more sort of marionette-like. It's sort of just, the question is how does this tiny change produce this I don't know. I guess I was also sort of assuming how does the form of the sword and the soul of the sword maker affect what the sword maker does? Well, in a deliberative sense, the sword maker figures out what to do, holding fixed the goal of the sword. Whereas it's not that's the sort of mechanism at play here. Rather, here it's just a kind of series of pushings and pullings. It sounds like. But I think you're right. Those pushings and pullings take place in the context of an organized animal body, which is set up so as to have these kinds of characteristic effects relative to expansions and contractions of the heart. Otherwise, they're going to be the kind of hookup that you need between thought, perception, desire, and emotion on the one hand, except quality emotion on the other. So that's probably right.
That setup part is what's super important, and that's kind of maybe even more so than the proportionality or the kind of guiding rationality. It's the setup, and I think the more complex, manifold puppet theater, as opposed to just single puppet, has this kind of setup in place, and I think that's what I'm really whereas artificially these are, I don't know if I have all the right vocabulary, but set up so that it unfurls in a certain way. What's doing that for the creature is its nature or something like that.
I guess I'm not sure that you need the puppet theater in order to get that. Maybe that's something I'm more sort of depth of. But as long as you have some sort of artful design, so that one small change can produce other changes of a predictable, determinate variety. It seems like you've got what it needs. And that doesn't have to be a whole theater. It can just be one
nice.
little guy
Yeah.
thrashing another with a sword or something.
Yeah, I figured it was just more vivid, I guess, with the theater, that there's more organization, and so therefore there's more to set up.
These are amazing things, right? Like, it's amazing. Like, automata.
Yeah, at any of them.
Like,
Yeah.
Jumping frogs.
Yeah.
Like, it's the. Jumping.
Yeah, and Daedalus is almost like a god because he can get his statues to move. Yeah.
Yeah. And so like, even if it's not a theater, I feel like this idea is like, think about how wonderful a puppet is. Now think about how much more wonderful like we are. But the mechanism is the same. Is the thought. Just like one small motion at the beginning to produce like a large sword whack at the end. The music from the exactly. I like that.
I'll never get that in my head.
The puppet theater.
I'll be ringing my ears.
Yeah, on the day that I die.
Yeah, in my notes I have this distinction between one puppet, an array of puppets moving. If there's just one puppet, then the initiation is the earliest sequence. Let's see. And perception would correspond to yeah. So I guess it's just with a single puppet, there's something where there's like some single chain, and you're looking at the like earliest member of the chain of cause and effect, which is maybe the best way to read the passage. But if you have an array of puppets, you no longer have kind of like one single causal chain. It's like branching out in these different directions or something like that. And so then again, it would bring in this setup order type thing a little bit more. So maybe that's one efficient causal chain versus some like coordinated set of efficient causal chains. But yeah, I'm not sure if it's necessary. It maybe vivifies this point about setup and all that stuff.
It might depend on like what point he's specifically trying to make. And I guess I was tending to read it in a more deflationary way, but the point was just like the small point that's a small motion at the beginning can produce a big motion at the end by means of a series of intermediate causes, all of which are like purely mechanical. You don't need the soul to control kind of like every single like part of the motion. It just needs to sort of do something at the beginning.
Which is initiate the desire, it sounds like, on this account.
Exactly.
Yeah. So desire will have some kind of necessary psychophysical substructure, whereas the perception won't need to have that.
It doesn't have to,
Which is
Which is
deflationary and where I'm trying to get. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this has all been extremely helpful for trying to articulate my way and work my way through.
I think you're right.
I sometimes wonder if Alan overreads those things. Yeah, he spends a lot of time with them. And at a certain point, when you're like going into the deep matter of like how hot-light formations work, I think you've lost it's just a metaphor.
I guess I have this virtue epistemology thing where when Bob Dylan makes terribly unlistenable albums in the 1980s, he made so much great music and invented so many forms of musical expression. I've never done something like that, so who am I to say this music is bad? How could I even know? And so I kind of suspend my judgment with respect to Alan.
Okay.
Yeah.
I heard about the hot representation thing. That was nuts. It's like, why would you put your whole theory in a metaphor that...
Is this posterior analytics, book 217 or whatever? Yeah. 219, yeah.
If you actually had a theory of this, you wouldn't use this metaphor and like cram all the most important moves into it. The point is you don't need a theory. That's why you need the metaphor. So like, it's kind of like this.
Rupert took the deep dive, so I think you would have qualified yourself now to say how licensed Alan is to push on these metaphors.
I mean, there's also methodological issues that arise because when you interpret metaphors in this way, I feel like you often have to rely on evidence that isn't very purposive. I think hot-light formation evidence is pretty weak. It's just mostly later, as I know, later military texts which we have to project onto the 4th century. And here again with public theatres, we're relying on some very weak historical inferences. Just doesn't seem worth it to me.
It also seems like when he says what point he's making with the metaphor and then gives the metaphor, I think that this is methodological like points. You shouldn't assume that he means the metaphor to do any more work than what he says it's doing, unless there there are things that like actually don't make sense if you. But it seems to me like there's a perfectly good way of reading this metaphor, which you're just making this one small point, and like
About the
everything
causal
else is
chain,
just
yeah.
overreading, yeah.
I mean, you know, you can use a metaphor to help. Maybe this is interesting. You can use a metaphor to help disambiguate a difficult claim, which he tries to illustrate by means of a metaphor. So you might think like, there are different ways of taking this claim. The metaphor fits best with this way of thinking about it. So this is probably what he intended.
Right. I mean, maybe. Although it depends, because sometimes he intends the metaphor to apply to just kind of like one little thing and not to sort of like other parts of the theory. So I think in a way, like this is the problem that Nussbaum and Continual are running into. And they're saying like, oh, this shows something in general about like the psychophysical. Like, no, like this metaphor only applies to how the sort of growth of the heart could produce like emotion in my arm, or at least that's what it seems to be doing in the passage. And the fact that like
I guess one of their points is that Aristotle's silent about psychophysical processes underlying perception and deanima, and they take this argument from silence to be like for their view somehow, that it's like not part of the account or so, like the what deanima's for. If there's this underlying physical process, so it's, that's also a fair point. But so I forget what point I was trying to make there. But a general response to what you were saying also is that I was thinking I really should take one stand on the metaphor rather than the other. And what your comments and suggestions have helped me see is that I can present both interpretations of the analogy or metaphor and show that this kind of Bernian alteration thing works on both of them. And especially even on Nussbaum's own terms of interpretation, you can still get this as compelling or more compelling account with this alternative notion of alteration. So that's really helpful.
Yeah, and you might want to just like flag, like, oh, here are some differences, philosophical differences, that I take the metaphor, but like I can remain neutral on that. My goal is not that.
Yeah, but I will spend 3 pages waxing poetic on this taxis point. Yeah, that I'm excited about. Yeah.
Not doing wrong, she just didn't slim down for us. Yeah. But she didn't know the ingredients in some of the coffees.
And yeah, I think this idea that like it's important that he's chosen a puppet as opposed to like I don't know, a bunch of dominoes falling over or something, or that there is something about sort of like artfulness of the construction which is sort of like relevant to this point.
Because as we were saying, these are thaumata. Yeah.
Well, there's a sort of holistic mechanical production.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Right.
So it's like all the pieces are moving together in unison to produce some kind of activity that's defined. Sword fighting or whatever and whatnot. Whereas the domino is just kind of like too linear and not holistic enough.
Yeah, it's linear, but also like I guess it's overdetermined in the dominoes because like the motion at the beginning of the domino is like the same in magnitude as the motion at the end. So it's not as though sort of like one small thing at the beginning and a big thing later. But yeah, I think also what you're saying is right that you have something which is sort of like the moving of a pin, which is like radically unlike the kind of like thrashing of the sword, and yet by means of mechanical like explanations, you can sort of a lot of things are set up in the right way. So yeah, I think that's helpful.
Yeah, this term of the setup locution is helpful to me too.
And then that's square. That goes sideways. Like, why is that written like that? Yeah. On the chart.
I just think with Aristotle, he's doing this quite frequently, where it's like he is understanding how things are materially being produced in reality is sort of like holistic, synthetic level, right? So the Roy was saying yesterday, right? The ruler has to have a sense of how all the parts cohere as a kind of task or project, and knows how to delegate them. There's a sort of so in the puppet analogy, I see sort of like holistic material production of the puppet's movements as something imitating a whole, like a human being.
Don't buy them. We have tons of them.
And then I didn't get any pushback on the spiritualist Berniette interpretation of sense perception, the Salmson thing that in fact perception, quote unquote, it's doubtful whether there's any movement or actualization occurring when the eye sees or ear hears that has any physical or physiological aspect. Any last concerns or worries about these kind of like spiritualist views? I don't think Mike accepts spiritualism.
Yeah, no, I think he's got his doubts.
Yeah.
But he's also not a crude literalist, as he puts it.
Okay.
Or like the silliest kind of literalist.
Sriracha.
Yeah, seems right to me.
Yes.
I like to agree with that if possible.
I'll send it to Mike then to try to get the objections from the non-spiritualist.
Yeah.
It's an interesting project, right?
You said this is going to be.
Course seminar, really old seminar paper that I'm turning.
Are you looking to eventually turn it into something else?
Yeah, I feel like all my projects, if I have enough time,
Yeah.
I just keep deepening them eventually, and if, especially if I make progress on this analogy or something like that, it could be useful. And applying Berniette to the Demo to Anomalia might also be useful.
You usually find little strands.
It looks like the sun is coming out.
Nice. We could walk to the end of the pier.
We're gonna walk through here. I would like to use the bathroom. I have
Yeah?
a snack.
Good luck.
Is there not one?
If there is one, it's a.
I think they're public, and they're like
Oh,
around the
great.
corner or something like that.
Okay.
If there
I'll
is
be
one,
back
it's a
then.
roll of dice. Look how clean it is.
Oh, I'm not. I'm not very hygienic. I'll just ask them. Are you guys gonna stay here for the night?
Yeah.
This was entirely too soon, by the way.
Thanks again for the